I'd be keen to know from the panellists where you are with TCFD, what's been considered, and what you see the biggest challenges are, especially when it comes to, it's in the title really, climate-related financial disclosures. So it's about linking climate and finance. So Peter, I'd like to ask that question to you first.
Yeah, I think fundamentally I have high hopes that TCFD actually will be one of the catalysts that helps integrate the focus on net zero into the economic equation, because that's what's missing at the moment, especially as Bill was suggesting for shorter term investment strategies where you don't know how much value or risk avoidance does your additional investment really yield. But for us, the way we look at it is we take our flagship funds and that's where we implement these kind of things first. And we've actually used 427 as a model, very happy with that. And it's just what you learn is just makes it so obvious and easy to grasp, and the transparency for a whole portfolio of 30, 40 buildings is something that allows you to be systematic, to explain to your investors how big the risk is. It can be reassuring, but it can also be eye-opening when you realize that some of your assets may be stranded actually by 2035, whatever the date.
So can I jump in there?
Yeah.
What are you going to do about those stranded assets? Have you got a plan yet?
Well, this was actually...
putting you on the spotlight, really.
Yeah, that's all right. This was actually a reference to a deal we were looking at, not in one of our funds, but it was outside. And it was the first time we were looking at a large office transaction in Germany. And there the result was that it would have been stranded by 2036 unless the grid is 100% renewable. And it was a big question, because the problem was that at this stage the group of consultants were not yet in a position to exactly specify how the upgrades would work, what the overall cost picture would be. So what you mentioned, the challenge of upskilling was very tangible in that moment, and it made the whole conversation about the acquisition, which was a sizable one, much more complicated. And for me, that was the first time I was actually close to a transaction where it led to this not going ahead, it was not the reason that it would be stranded. There were other reasons, but certainly it made the whole situation
it had an impact.
More unclear. Yeah.
Okay. I think, Eimear, from your perspective and ICG, have you considered TCFD and moved forward with that as an agenda item?
Yes. So we use the TCFD framework really to guide our entire climate strategy. And we've been reporting against the TCFD since 2019. We're also a listed asset manager, so it will become mandatory for us very shortly. And we're also looking now at the TCFD requirements and how they will apply at fund level, so we can start to implement those in advance. But yeah, we've done a lot around it. In the early days, we did a gap analysis of our entire kind of how we operate really, and sort of looked at our kind of governance framework, and made sure that we appointed an NED on the board responsible for ESG, and also we've developed a climate risk assessment tool which we embed into our ESG screening checklist, so we look at climate risk as so every single deal that goes to investment committee essentially gets a climate risk score, and it's focused quite heavily on our corporates at the moment, but we're building that out more and more for real estate, and so it's low, medium, high, or very high. And then if you score kind of high or very high, then you're required to do kind of additional questions during the due diligence stage. But it's very transparent to the investment committee members where the risks lie. So that's been a really key tool for us. We've also expanded our exclusion list. Our exclusion list now excludes investments in coal, oil and gas, where it's more than majority of the revenue from any of those. So it's quite an extensive exclusion list, and I guess it lends to our whole sort of pathway towards net zero and decarbonisation of our portfolios.
Okay, thank you. Bill, Nina, are you aware of, well, obviously aware of TCFD, but are you aware of any taking on from Peter's comment about deals that have gone through or fallen through because of physical climate risk or transition climate risk? Is that something that is increasing? You're seeing happen more?
I mean, I think we've definitely kind of had long-standing kind of, we won't invest in assets that are in very, very high flood risk areas. But I think properly integrating long-term physical climate risks, we're probably relatively early days in, excluding deals because of that, but obviously sort of thinking about that more. I think one of the interesting things about TCFD, and obviously we're thinking about both transition and physical risk, we've looked corporately and real estate specifically a lot of the physical climate risk models at the moment. I think the interesting thing is obviously the investors are pushing that agenda at the moment about physical climate risk, but I think there is still a bit of a so what question. Like, what are investors actually going to do with that information? If you use 247 to do your analysis, 427 to do your analysis, and we use someone else, and those climate VARs are at the moment very different between different providers, how do investors make sense of what that kind of risk actually is? And, in the same that we organisationally, big organisations have a lot of resource to look at that information, smaller investors won't have the resource to sort of interrogate or understand that at the moment. And we've started to have discussion with some of our larger investors about, okay, what does that mean in terms of risk tolerance? What level of risk is acceptable for you on a portfolio level? Because that's the bit that has to influence the acquisition decision making. If you're going to invest in many parts of Asia in particular, we don't do as much in the US, but the same would be true there, you're invariably going to have a much higher climate risk in Asia than you are in parts of Europe. Does that mean someone who's a global diversified investor wants to not be in Asia because of the physical climate risk? Probably not at the moment. So therefore, what level of portfolio risk do we need? And then that should influence whether or not we do deals, probably at a portfolio level rather than an asset specific level. The other thing we found at the moment is a lot of the tools don't necessarily allow us to feed back the impact resilience measures at a building into the climate VAR models. And again, that's something we think needs to develop a bit, particularly for kind of TCFD reporting. So I think at the moment it's quite hard to use that as a sort of go or no go on decision making, but it is kind of inputting as part of that. And clearly if it was a really, really high risk, then no. But if it's a high risk in 2060, I think that becomes a bit more difficult at the moment to say whether you should proceed or not with those deals. But that's definitely where it's going, and probably we'll see over the next 2 to 3 years increased sophistication around that and conversations with our investors, but it's probably not there quite yet.
I think for us things have that we're not that different, but I think for us I would say things have really changed in the last year or two, okay, because aside from physical risks around climate change, I think this much bigger focus on transition to net zero changes the game a lot. So variously around this table there'll be people making commitments to 2030 or 2040 or 2050 in various ways, and we published a pathway to net zero. I'm sure EVORA would have been involved back end of 2020, and that changes the mindset. So there are assets that we simply don't believe we can own and get to net zero 2030, which means that we wouldn't buy those assets. It means if we're owning them already, we've got to be thoughtful and creative and make a judgment about where's technology going. Will we get enough roadway and assistance in making those assets work for us or not? And this thing about stranded assets, by the way, this isn't a game where there's an asset that gets stranded and it's left all on its own and that's a merry-go-round. The real world we're in is some assets are going to accelerate in terms of depreciation and obsolescence relatively quickly now. And the goal of everyone around this table, I'm sure, is we don't want to be in the assets that end up in that place. But there will be a lot of owners of assets that end up in a place which is unusable. So when I think about our investment committee now, it's focused on how do we actually manage this asset to net zero is really front and centre. And again, 2 years ago it wouldn't have been. 2 years ago, we were thinking about flood risk more.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a game changer. This race to zero, transition to net zero, I think, carbon's not the only thing that matters, but boy, that does change our behaviour.
Yeah. I think for one of my recent experiences, we supported due diligence on a real estate asset. It was in Germany again, and we looked at. In looking at the building, there were a number of risks. So there was a high stranding risk, a lot of initiatives that needed to be addressed. And as a result of that, the client that I was working for, wasn't any of you, adjusted the price offering. But the market is not moving at the same pace. So others did not. And the building, which was still from a financial perspective, it was attractive to the client. They lost out on that deal because they'd incorporated costs in to address net zero. So they, on the one hand, they'll be saying that okay, we're happy we didn't progress with that deal because it didn't go through because climate. We needed to address climate risk. But also, you've got a large proportion of the market that is not with you yet. They're not moving forward, and so we have a number of front runners that are progressing net zero carbon, that are progressing. And what I think is really important, I'm keen to get your views on this, is how do we bring that long tail of real estate operators, whether it's private equity or otherwise, into this agenda to address and understand this, because as an industry, that's what we need to happen.
Yeah, there's going to be winners and losers, aren't there?
Yeah.
And probably you've got in the room here people who are relatively enlightened. I worry more about the people who didn't come here today or haven't called in, and there will be winners and losers, and in a sense the losers will dwindle and the winners will attract more capital and they will be the players of the future. And again, I think the time frame is important here. Investors who think longer term have already got to think about this. Investors that think shorter term may end up with some adverse surprises. Absolutely. They may end up with assets they thought were liquid that are no longer liquid, for example.
Yes, yeah, clear. Emilie, I'm going to come back to you. I think I'm keen to get your views on this, and also Moody's and your climate solutions are known for physical climate risk. But from a TCFD perspective, we need to consider not just physical climate risk, but also transition climate risk. So can you please just elaborate on this, elaborate what your views on where the market is and what you're doing to take things forward?
Sure, and I'd love to react to a few things. Great discussion. One, the last point that was made about the implication of the information asymmetry on the market and the fact that some folks just are not looking at this. From a cynical, profit-driven standpoint, there's a lot of good deals to be made, and your clients may maybe have a little bit of heartburn about having missed on that deal, but in the end, they're probably going to come out ahead. Now, the problem is from a what we need to do standpoint and saving the planet standpoint, we need to bring everyone on board onto those considerations. And this is why mainstreaming is so important. It just needs to be embedded into the tools that people already use for decision making, so they don't need to think more and add things from different bits and purposes. And to Nina's point, right now there's a wide range of how this is modeled on the market. And it's normal. I would be concerned if you compare the outputs from different providers from an exposure standpoint to physical risk and found very different risk profiles. That would concern me. The fact that the value at risk or the financial modeling of what that means are different, I think, is to be expected because it's still a nascent discipline. And I can tell you, for example, that the next iteration of financial modeling that we're going to do is going to be informed not just by what we've done so far, but also the recent acquisition of RMS, which brings, as part of the CAT models, a view of the expected loss and how much is insured. And so it's going to be a different number because it's going to be much more sophisticated. And there's also a lot of secondary impacts that are really hard to model, impacts of migration, impacts of changes in industry trends in certain regions because of chronic impact. So this is very complicated, and you're absolutely right to compare and to use it as input rather than as a final answer in terms of decisions. And now to your question about transition risk, yes, of course. We're investing in building out our net zero capabilities right now for all sectors, but CRE specifically is what I'm most excited about probably. We're working with a partner who has a great model and platform to support investors, lenders, developers in understanding at a very granular level their options for building retrofit to meet internal, external targets, local compliance requirements, net zero pathways. And so going back to the challenges that Peter was mentioning earlier on, we just didn't have a path for how to get this building or how much it was going to cost to get it to net zero. This is a platform that allows users to optimize against various requirements with a very detailed catalog of retrofit options, looking at technology selection, you look at payback period, emission pathways, you get cost, and you get a very concrete path forward, right? So there's the two sides of the coins, both what are the risks, how much is it going to cost, how much is it going to cost to not do anything, and opportunities as an investor, as a lender, can I help make this happen? As a building owner, can I be ahead of the game? And so really trying to help make the transition to net zero concrete. And that's going to be important to not only to complement the physical risk offering that we have, but to feed into our mortgage models, our platforms, and to support partners like EVORA so that we all continue to enhance how we help the market with this transition.